This video has been produced to support community engagement about improving the financial sustainability of Snowy Valleys Council. It's an opportunity to hear about the key issues and to provide feedback on your preferred areas of focus via the survey. And there's further information available at the link shown on your screen. This engagement is being undertaken in parallel to the work on the rate options study. It's important to note that these two issues are distinct, but they are related too. They're both potentially impacting on people's rates. The information from this process will help inform Council's decisions in its annual operating budget, its 10-year long-term financial plan, and in its next delivery program, which covers the services and infrastructure that Council delivers and also the resources required to fund those works. For Council, financial sustainability is about achieving a balance between its revenues from things like rates and fees and charges and its expenses, the delivery of services and infrastructure to the community. At the moment, this situation is not balanced. Council receives about $31 million a year, but it's spending about $34.5 million a year. In other words, its annual operating deficit is about $3.5 million. This situation will deteriorate next year, with $650,000 of revenues being lost from the expiry of the special rate variation from the former Tumut Shire. Expenses are also forecast to increase, with another $350,000 being required to fund the new assets largely delivered by grant funding in recent years. The end result is that Council's operating deficit is forecast to increase to closer to $4.5 million per annum. The key question, no doubt, is how did we get here? It's important to note that this situation hasn't developed overnight. Rather, it reflects underlying trends in the financial performance of each of the former councils prior to the merger. A good place to start to understand the issues is the assessment of the financial sustainability of all New South Wales councils that was undertaken by New South Wales Treasury Corporation in 2013. T-Corp assessed the sustainability of the former Tumut Shire as moderate with a neutral outlook, and the former Tumbarumba Shire Council was assessed as having a strong financial sustainability but with a negative outlook. If we now look at the actual performance of the former councils since that time, noting that T-Corp's assessment was only based on data up to 2012, we can see that its outlook has proved fairly accurate. Let's start with the former Tumut Shire Council. As can be seen in this chart, Council had posted an operating deficit for a couple of years prior to T-Corp's assessment, but the situation had improved and subsequently Council generally posted an operating surplus. It's worth noting that that sawtooth up and down is the result of grants and extra revenues from private works and special projects that Council might have undertaken. And if we then overlay a trend line, we can see that the situation appears to be improving. Or more conservatively, and reflecting T-Corp's assessment, we could say that Council had a moderate level of financial sustainability and with a neutral outlook. It wasn't getting any worse, wasn't getting any better. If we now have a look at Tumbarumba, we can see that Council had posted operating surpluses each year leading up to T-Corp's assessment. The particularly strong year in 2012 associated in part with natural disaster funding. But as T-Corp had identified, the performance was dropping off over time. And if we again overlay a trend line, we can see that the performance was deteriorating over time. So the next step to understanding the issue is to combine the results from the former councils, and that's shown in this chart. In terms of scale, the former Tumut Shire made up about 60% of overall revenues and Tumbarumba made up about 40%. So as can be seen, the financial performance of the two former councils combined was improving leading up to the 2012 T-Corp assessment when it peaked, but since then it has been deteriorating over time. And again, it's just worth noting that the sawtooth shape of that line is just a reflection of variations in grants from year to year and other things like private works and projects undertaken by council. So again, if we just look at a trend line overlaid, you can see that there's a deterioration in performance over time. So that underlying trend in financial performance of the former councils is certainly part of the explanation for how we got to this point, but there's also another few issues that have also contributed. The first of these is the loss of the work from Roads and Maritime Services, particularly the major projects on Go Cup Road that are now being completed. Now, this isn't about council generating a profit on this work, It's about the loss of economies of scale that council realises from doing this extra work. Part of the revenues from the work goes to funding overheads, so functions like finance and HR, IT, the cost of the depots, cost of council's engineering managers. These are functions that council needs to fund regardless. And so without these extra revenues to help funding them, there's a negative impact of somewhere around $1.5 million a year on council's operating result. And so that's around a third or so of the deficit that council finds itself in now. Another factor is what's often referred to as service creep. And that's where council is spending more money to deliver better services. And there's a number of examples where council has made a conscious decision to improve its services over the last few years in order to deliver better outcomes for the community. And the last major factor that's contributing to the situation is new assets. Council has secured a significant amount of grant funding in recent years to build a range of new community assets, and these cost money to operate and maintain. There are also additional depreciation expenses associated with them, which represent the long-term cost of providing the service and renewing the assets. So the end result of all this is that council is spending more on the delivery of services and infrastructure for the community than it is getting in rates, fees and charges. So how do we fix the situation? How do we get back to the point where there's a balance between the money that council gets in through rates, fees and charges and the cost of the services and infrastructure that council delivers? It's important to recognise that there isn't any silver bullet. The solution is best achieved through a range of measures, and I'll go through each of these now. The first strategy is pursuing efficiencies. The reality is that this is basically reductions in employee costs, because these make up about half of council's operating costs excluding depreciation. But it's important to note that council has already realised something like $500,000 a year in savings from the recent restructure, and that further savings beyond this are going to become increasingly difficult without impacting on service delivery and or increasing council's risk. So the strategy here is really reviewing positions when they become vacant and looking at opportunities to make changes to save some money. The second strategy is about making savings in procurement. Council already purchases materials and contractors on a competitive basis, but this is about looking at changes to the way that council does that. For example, bulk buying through the Canberra Region Joint Organisation of Councils might be an option. The third strategy is private works, increasing council's revenues by delivering services to external customers. As was noted earlier, one of the key contributing factors to the current situation is the loss of major project work on Go Cup Road. If council can supplement this with delivering services to New South Wales Government, to other councils and major corporations like Snowy Hydro, then it can offset this situation. But it's important that council treats this like a business and manages the commercial risks. The fourth strategy is increasing council's revenues by increasing fees and charges. Here, we're starting to get into the actions that will have a direct impact on the community. Before considering how much this could help close the gap, it's important to have a look at what actual services council is generating its fees and charges from. Council generates about $2.5 million a year in fees and charges. Opportunities to increase these revenues really need to be taken on a case-by-case basis, looking at each service individually. Building rentals make up about a quarter of the total, but there's a need to consider the market rate for these buildings, the long-term arrangements with existing tenants, the fact that a number of the buildings are actually rented by community groups, and like many of these services, council really needs to weigh up the business versus the community outcomes in these cases. Land use and environmental fees and charges, many of these are like DA fees are set by New South Wales Government, and council doesn't have an opportunity to change them. Fees and charges for children's services like aged and disability and community transport services are generally set to cover the costs of these services, and increasing the cost of the service provision to the community is something council would want to consider pretty carefully. As with cemeteries, which generally cover their costs, caravan parks are generating about $200,000 a year at the moment. There's an opportunity to increase that. particularly off the back of the significant investment in some of the sites. And council will be working through the business planning and management models to achieve the best outcome for the community. Fees and charges for pools and the use of sports ground and parks facilities is a good example of the need to balance out community outcomes. So the value of people having access to these facilities versus the increasing the revenues from their use. And the same goes for halls, where council is obviously keen to promote the gathering together for community purposes. So in summary, council's got limited opportunities to increase its revenues from fees and charges without having an impact on the users of those services, and in each case it needs to be weighed up carefully. The next strategy is back on the expenditure side, and that's looking at levels of service. And when we talk about varying levels of service, what we're really talking about is reducing the amount that council's spending on delivery of services and infrastructure to the community. This table summarises the 6 main service areas that are funded by general rates and by the General Financial Assistance Grant from the federal government. Service areas that are basically self-funding have been excluded, as these are more appropriately considered as part of the fees and charges review and also the pursuit of efficiencies across the organisation. So what we can see here is that the total net cost of delivering those services, after accounting for the grants and income associated with them, is about $16 million a year. But about a third of this is depreciation expenses, the majority of which are associated with council's road network. And while council continues to review its depreciation estimates, there's really not an opportunity to change this significantly unless council was to get rid of some of its assets. The only real opportunities to do that are to sell off buildings, and there's impacts on the community associated with doing that. So what we're left with then is looking at ways to cut the other expenses associated with these services. The majority of these are employee costs, but there's also purchasing materials, engaging contractors, and things like electricity and insurance. And the best way to understand the options is to work through each of these service areas individually, and we'll do that now. First up, we've got transport and drainage, and reducing expenditure here is reducing the levels of service in terms of the potholes that are patched, the unsealed roads that are graded, trees that are trimmed, trip hazards that are fixed on footpaths. The service level review from 2018 did find that these services are highly important to the community, but also found that satisfaction was trending upwards. Another point worth considering is that an independent condition assessment of council's road network found that there was a very low incidence of failures. So council is very much on top of the maintenance required in terms of potholes patched and all that, which suggests that it might be able to wind back the maintenance costs without impacting service levels considerably. Of course, we've been through a very dry period, so if there was a long streak of wet weather, the roads would deteriorate and funding would need to increase to maintain those service levels. Council also needs to watch that it doesn't reduce the funding for roads too far, as it can impact the Roads to Recovery grant from the federal government, which is tied to the amount that council spends. Next up, we've got open spaces and facilities, and reducing service levels here means mowing parks and sports grounds less, reducing the quality of playing surfaces, reducing the cleaning frequency of public toilets, the opening hours for pools, the presentation of cemeteries, the amount of work that's done on street trees to fix up problem trees, and potentially reducing the maintenance of buildings, although a lot of the costs here are fixed. It's worth noting that the service level review did find that there was less of a gap in this area compared to other services. The community was generally more satisfied. But council also needs to recognise that it's invested considerably in new assets over the last few years, and these all cost money to maintain. And council has also increased the service standards in some areas like cemeteries in response to feedback from the community. Next up, we've got tourism and economic development. There's less opportunities to vary the levels of service here. There's some fixed arrangements in place at Tumut and Cairn Cove and visitor centres. The Tumbarumba Visitor Centre is really about the opening hours in terms of the costs, and reducing the marketing and visitor attraction budgets and accessibility and support for business needs to be considered carefully. The service level review found that there was significant support for increasing council's service delivery in these areas, not reducing them. Next up, we've got community services, and there's some barriers to reducing service levels here. Firstly, foreign emergency services, so support for RFS and SES is largely fixed by legislation. Council can't just cut these costs. With libraries, the cost is largely in opening the facilities, so reductions mean reducing opening hours. Community development is about how many events council holds and supports, the direct support that it's providing to community groups. And community engagement is about how well council is relating with the community. And that was really emphasised as being important in the service level review. Libraries and community development were identified as being a lower importance, higher satisfaction services generally, but the specific users of these facilities do value them a lot more highly. And similarly, emergency management was identified by the community as being really critical, something they didn't want to see council reduce. Onto land use and environment. Most of these activities are actually legislative requirements that council must do. Varying the levels of service does have significant impacts. Things like town planning is about the accessibility of assistance to help people submit DAs and to facilitate investment in the local government area. Environmental weed management, there's not just the direct costs funded by council, but there's a lot of opportunities that council's been able to generate grants to help improve environmental outcomes. The range of services is about public safety and again legislation. The feedback from the service level review was identified DA processing as a strong overall driver of satisfaction with council, and the comparisons against other councils surveyed showed that satisfaction with Snowy Valleys was actually higher. So again, this is one that council would need to consider carefully before it reduced the service levels. Last but not least is internal services. Here it's more about efficiencies rather than varying levels of service, because this is about the back office support, the finance, HR, IT, administration, engineering services that supports the frontline service delivery. This is also about how council manages its risks, and that can have a direct impact on the community too. Council has recognised the need to review its overheads, and by undertaking that exercise, it'll help to better attribute the costs of delivering the frontline services and look at how the council's delivering them. Feedback from the community is part of the service level review. There was a general acknowledgement there's a need to invest in support services, and certainly in terms of customer service and the accessibility to council, these were identified as critical to the community satisfaction with council. So any cost reductions here need to be balanced carefully against reducing service delivery to the community. So the final strategy that council's got to help improve its financial situation is back on the revenue side, and that's a special rate variation. As was noted earlier, one of the contributing factors to the current situation is the expiry of a special rate variation in the former Tumut Shire that generates $650,000 a year. Given the situation that council finds itself in, it would seem reasonable that council would need to replace this amount of revenues as a minimum. But given the difficulties in achieving improvements across these other strategy areas, council may need to consider a larger special rate variation to help bridge the gap. At this stage, council's not proposing any specific amount, but it's seeking feedback from the community on all of these options and where the community would like to see council to focus on. So where to from here? Well, council obviously needs to take opportunities to improve efficiencies and reduce operating expenses wherever it can. But given that council's cash reserves are very limited, it needs to preserve them as well, and that means reducing the capital works program. And the majority of that is spent on rebuilding roads. As was noted earlier though, a recent independent condition assessment found that council's road network is in excellent condition, so there is potential to reduce expenditure over the next few years without impacting service levels. But it's obviously not something that council can do long term. But over the long term, council needs to balance its budget. That means not spending any more on service delivery and infrastructure than what it gets in rates, fees and charges. And the key document that sets out this plan is the delivery program. That explains what council's going to do and how it's going to pay for it. And councils prepare these after each election. to cover their term of office. With the postponement of the local government elections until 2021, that means Council's got some more time to prepare for its next delivery program, but it's important that the conversation continues up to that time. It needs to be a balance between each of the strategies that have been discussed in this video. So thanks for taking the time to hear a bit more about Council's financial sustainability challenges and the way to improve that. I encourage you to complete the survey and to check out further information at the Your Voice Snowy Valleys website.